Hello and welcome again to BIB5132 Gospels, God's Means of Providing Redemption. We are in week 4 of the course, looking at Jesus' early Galilean ministry. I thought it would be helpful for us to spend a little more time looking at background issues, the context within this early Galilean ministry is taking place. So even as Jesus proclaimed a radical message with unprecedented authority, he lived and taught within an established context of Jewish piety, piety being devotion to God. In the ancient world, goes for both Jewish and Greco-Roman world, piety, i.e. devotion to God, encompassed every aspect of a person's life. There was little to no separation between the sacred and the secular, since every secular project was somehow related to religious devotion to the gods. Josephus could write in his work Against Apion, "Piety governs all our actions and occupations and speech. None of these things did our lawgiver leave unexamined or indeterminate." So devotion to God encompassed every aspect of Jewish life. So we'll cover some essential information about Jewish piety. First is the idea of unity and diversity. First century Judaism was united around their theological beliefs in monotheism, election, and eschatology. These beliefs in monotheism, that God alone was God, Hear, O Israel, the Lord your God, the Lord is one. Election, that Israel is God's chosen people. And eschatology, what would God do in the future to rescue his people, to act, to set things right, to bring deliverance. These three things, monotheism, election, and eschatology, were their core beliefs. And this led to practices, the practice of circumcision, the dietary rules, Sabbath observance. Those are three primary areas of practices that set the Jewish people apart for their election, with their belief in God alone, monotheism. So within their unity of belief in these areas and practice, there were different interpretations of the Torah. So there's unity around the core, monotheism, election, and eschatology, but there's diversity of interpretation. So there are different rabbinic schools of Hillel and Shammai, different ways of living out their devotion to God. And you see that with the Essenes, with the Pharisees, with the Sadducees, with the Zealots. There's a great deal of diversity within this unity. And this is a bit of a side note, but this diversity also impacted first century Jewish understanding of the relationship between law and grace. So generalized stereotypes, that all first century Jews were legalists, for example, do not fit historical reality. So were some legalists? Of course, some were, and Paul is responding to that in some of his writing, but not all were. So just this initial understanding that there was unity within first century Jewish piety and great diversity. So some examples of this: piety in the temple. The temple stood at the center of Jewish religious life. It's hard sometimes for modern readers to understand this, or for modern cultures to understand the centrality of the temple in Jewish devotion to God, Jewish piety. Daily sacrifices and offerings took place, along with special sacrifices on the Sabbath, on New Moon, on New Year, the Day of Atonement, and the three major pilgrimage festivals, Passover, Pentecost, and Tabernacles. Passover being the most important of those three, which would draw pilgrims from all over the world. Individuals could also voluntarily bring sacrifices for purification, for transgressions, or thanksgiving. Jewish men over 20 were required to pay a temple tax of half a shekel every year. This is evident in Matthew 17:24-27. So the temple really stood at the center of Jewish thinking in terms of relationship to God, access to God, approach to God, how to be right with God. That leads to the next one, piety in the synagogue. So what happens when you live too far away to have easy access to the temple? Well, the synagogue was the local place to pray and study Torah as a community. So the translations of the Old Testament from Hebrew to Greek, that's the Septuagint, the Greek translation, and to Aramaic, that's the Targums. The translation of Hebrew into Greek and Aramaic likely arose in the synagogue context, in the response to the regular reading of the Old Testament in local synagogues. So the most common Greek title for a synagogue is actually prosuke, place of prayer. The importance of the local synagogue increased the farther you lived from the Jerusalem temple, and the prominence of the synagogue would increase. Synagogues also functioned as community centers for a range of religious, social, economic, collections of alms, the temple tax, and juridical activities. So it's evident as well that many God-fearing Gentiles attended synagogue service throughout the Roman Empire. And we'll see this in the book of Acts, that synagogues and God-fears play an important role. Also in Jesus' ministry is quite significant. His speaking in synagogues, preaching in synagogues. Jairus is a local synagogue ruler. So the place of the synagogue is a place that was very important for Jewish piety and devotion to God on the local level, the farther one is removed from the temple. Then moving beyond that is piety in general in daily life. So Jewish piety permeated daily life and made first century Jews a very distinct social ethnic group within the Greco-Roman world. And this included, as I mentioned above, practices of circumcision, which is a mandatory sign of covenant membership for the Jews, dietary observances, and this is what made it almost impossible for Jews to eat with Gentiles. Daily prayer, practices of daily prayer, particularly the recitation of the Shema. Purity, that has to do with cleanliness, cleanness, and Sabbath observance. So Jews were freed from Roman military service because of their refusal to fight or march on the Sabbath. So these are all very important aspects of daily life, daily devotion to God, that are evident at many different points in the Gospels. So some relevance to New Testament interpretation. Jewish piety is maintained and modified in early Christianity. And the beginnings of these modifications are evident to some degree in the Gospels. Jewish piety is maintained in its focus on monotheism, on prayer, and on the reading of Scripture. It is also dramatically modified in such a way as to allow and facilitate the Gentile mission. Gentile believers could approach and worship and serve God in a way that was pleasing to Him without first becoming Jewish. So the Jerusalem Council's letter to Gentile believers is very instructive in this regard in Acts 15:22 through 29. So some specific transformations or modifications. Circumcision. So this is continually practiced by Jewish believers, even Jewish Christian believers early on and to this day, but it's not forced upon Gentile believers, except by some of Paul's Jewish Christian opponents, commonly called the Judaizers. So Paul argues against the necessity of circumcision for salvation throughout Galatians and throughout Romans, although he approved of it as a cultural practice. In Acts 16:3, we hear about the circumcision of Timothy. He has no problem with it as such as a practice, but he's very opposed to being required for inclusion within God's new people, required for Gentiles. Food laws. How were food laws transformed in early Christianity? So in his ministry, Jesus declared all foods clean, Mark 7:19. And this evidently was remembered that he did this, but the significance of it wasn't recognized at first. And we see this because Peter's vision before the arrival of messengers from Cornelius in Acts 10:9 through 22, that Peter hadn't quite come to grips with what Jesus had meant in Mark 7:19, declaring all foods clean. So food laws continued to be an issue that needed to be addressed in the mixed Jew-Gentile churches in Rome and in Corinth. We see this Romans 14 and 1 Corinthians 8. But this is an aspect of transformation of Jewish piety. The purity laws, laws for cleanness, for ritual cleanness, for cultic activity and approach to the temple and the bringing of sacrifices. The requirements of ritual purity seem to be addressed by the author of Hebrews. And Hebrews 10:22, let us draw near with a true heart and full assurance of faith, with our hearts sprinkled clean from an evil conscience and our bodies washed with pure water. That there's an aspect of the purity requirements that are not required for Gentile believers because it was taking place spiritually, that there was a spiritual cleansing that took place by God's Spirit that made the ritual purity laws no longer needed for Gentile believers. And as well, moving on for Jewish believers, a Sabbath observance. Paul indicates that Gentile believers are no longer obligated to observe the Sabbath. This in Romans 14:5, Galatians 4:9 through 11, Colossians 2:16 through 17. And there's no historical connection between the Sabbath and early Christian Sunday worship. The Jewish Christians would have observed the Sabbath, while most Gentile Christians would have worked through the Sabbath on Saturday and worked on Sunday. So most early believers in Jesus throughout the Greco-Roman world worked 7 days a week. Many were slaves or from the lower classes, and they didn't have a day off. So they would worship on Sundays either before or after a day of work. The temple. The temple is reconceptualized by early Christians around Jesus himself as sacred space. And in John 2:21, Jesus himself points in this direction, that he is the replacement of the temple. Now this is revolutionary. Jesus' followers, though, are as the corporate and individual temple of God, are later described that way by Paul. In John 2:2, it's Jesus replacing the temple, and this is expanded by Paul primarily. The believers, as an extension of Jesus' body, then become the temple, the place where God dwells. So many of these transformations are anticipated already in Jesus' ministry in terms of food laws, in terms of the temple. He's anticipating these things. Others, there's no evidence of Jesus radically transforming them during his ministry, that he lived as a law-observant Jew within the context of Jewish piety and Judaism. He was recognized as such, and he ministered and he fit in that context. So it's very interesting to see how the early church doesn't read many of these concerns back into the gospel narratives, but there are those few points where Jesus is anticipating the later changes that would come, as in the food laws in Mark 7:19 and the temple in John 2:21.